We'll now be discussing differentiation between verbal and non-verbal communication in the context of intercultural communication. So start off by saying that both verbal and non-verbal communication are symbolic, communicating meaning in our pattern governed by rules in particular contexts and situations. If you remember from your Communication Science 1A work, we have verbal and non-verbal, and that they can be divided into vocal and non-vocal. Vocal meaning sound and non-vocal mean the absence of sound. If we have verbal communication and we talk about the vocal category, we're thinking about sound that has to do with the spoken word. When you think of verbal non-vocal, it has to be the written communication. Or it can also be going under sign language and so on, as other kind of communications out there. Non-verbal vocal could therefore be, do you remember? Paralanguage, which is pitch, rate, and all of those other things, volume, and rate of speech and all those things. Non-vocal in the non-verbal sense would have to then be in the focusing on body language and the environment, attire, facial expressions, eye contact, and all those other things are there. So they're just saying that there are differences in between verbal, non-verbal, I mean in terms of that basic sense, and also within culture. How important it is to note the differences in culture when it comes to non-verbal and verbal communication. Two American students attending school in France were hitchhiking to the university in Grenoble for the first day of classes. A French motorist picked them up and immediately started speaking English to them. They wondered how he knew they spoke English. Later, they took a train to Germany. The conductor walked into the compartment and scolded them in English for putting their feet on the opposite seat. Again, they wondered how had he known that they spoke English. As these examples show, non-verbal communication includes more than gestures. Even our appearance can communicate loudly. In fact, the very student's appearance, no doubt, was given a clue to their national identity. As this example shows, non-verbal behavior operates at a subconscious level. We really think about how we stand, what gestures we use, what facial expressions we're using, and at some point points out our behaviors, which brings to the conscious level. Of course, because cultures have a different interpretation of non-verbal specifically, I want to add there, we need to note that there could be misunderstandings in terms of communication, and therefore to be very sensitive to that. We therefore need to learn the rules and the meaning for language behavior in terms of, well, firstly, spelling and grammar. No one explains when you talk with someone you like, you lean forward, smile, and touch the person frequently because they'll communicate you really care about them. As things we tend to learn unconsciously as well. In some cultures, these behaviors often communicate positive meanings, but if someone does not display these behaviors, we like to react quite differently. The exact opposite is true in cultures that do not value leaning forward, smiling, touching your communication partner frequently. In some cultures, that might be offended by that behavior. Sometimes we learn strategies for nonverbal communication. So just talking about when you are learning nonverbal behavior, we might have a certain way of doing things in our culture of how to behave. Maybe with our partner or our best friend, there might not be the same rules as within another culture. Sometimes we learn certain things about appropriate behavior because we are socialized to do so, such as young women leaning to cross their legs at the ankles to keep their legs together when they sit. And this is being regarded as appropriate behavior because they were socialized to do so. You might also have been socialized to shake a hand, have a firm handshake as well, and not a limp handshake, which would indicate a person with a weak character. And in Africa, there are a number of variations of how to have a handshake on greeting, and it differentiates between the cultures there. And you can read through all those examples on page 113. There's quite a bit there. I'll now be moving on to coordinating nonverbal and verbal behaviors. Coordinating nonverbal and verbal behaviors is, you might have remembered this is once again from your Communication Science 1A work, which is to complement, contradict, all of those sort of ways of our nonverbal behavior. And once again, they mention again the reinforcement, substitute, and contradiction of verbal behaviors. When we shake our heads and we say no, we are reinforcing the behavior, also known as complementing the behavior. But here you'll be saying reinforcing. When we don't want to speak, we will substitute with a non-verbal expression, which could be like pointing, saying over there, which is instead of saying over there, you just point. And then, of course, the contradicting. And just one on the top of my head is when you tell your friend or your partner, I'm fine, but your face looks like, you're obviously not fine, you're contradicting the verbal expression with the non-verbal expression that's there. We tend to have less control of our nonverbal behavior, which is why people tend to believe our nonverbal behavior more. It's also known as nonverbal leakage, or containing the real message that's out there. So, have you ever received a compliment from someone you thought was not being sincere? You may have thought the person was insincere because her nonverbal communication contradicted her verbal communication. Perhaps she did not speak very forcefully or was not smiling, and therefore you did not believe what she was saying. Therefore, the real meaning is coming from the nonverbal communication there. The next section we're going to be looking at is what nonverbal behavior communicates. And we'll be leading into the cultural variations in nonverbal behavior, which makes up our last section of this work as well.